Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 5th session of This is Film Heritage in Practice. My name is Giovanna Fossati. I'm the Chief Curator of iFilm Museum and Professor of Film Heritage and Digital Film Culture, thank you, at the University of Amsterdam. So This is Film is a collaboration started in 2015 between the University of Amsterdam, iFilm Museum, and the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis. The sessions are carried out in close collaboration with the This is Film students at the university. They are in charge of introducing our guests and asking them questions. This year, the sessions are recorded, edited, and posted online with a few weeks' delay, and a selection of films screened during the sessions will be available on the iFilm player. This year, we focus on an overarching theme, that of global audiovisual archiving. We chose this topic as we feel that working together towards a truly global approach to audiovisual heritage is one of the most urgent challenges for our field. As mentioned in previous sessions, this sense of urgency is becoming even stronger when we are faced with tragedies, such as the recent events in Ukraine, where our colleagues at the Dovchenko National Center in Kyiv find themselves protecting the collection in the middle of a horrible war. I take this opportunity to mention that the program Kino Ukraina will take place here in from the 8th of May. The program has been organized in collaboration with our Ukrainian colleagues at the Dovchenko National Center, and the revenues will be donated to the center. So back to our focus on global audiovisual archiving. It should be mentioned that a number of very important and exemplary projects have pointed towards a different, more global and collaborative approach to film archival practice and research. I'd like to mention a few that have been really inspiration for our program this year. So the Audiovisual Preservation Exchange Project has taken place several times in Africa and Latin America since 2008, and we've discussed this project during the second session of This is Film with one of its promoters, Juana Suarez. The work of Aboubakar Sanogo, among others, for the African Film Heritage Project, which will be the focus of our session today. The long-standing non-institutional initiatives, such as June Giovanni's Pan-African Cinema Archive. These kind of projects are leading the way to a more horizontal and global approach to audiovisual archiving. The collaborative efforts carried out by the International Federation of Film Archives, FIAF, both in terms of outreach and support. The collaboration between the Nigerian Film Corporation and the University of Jos in Nigeria, the Goethe University and the Deutsche Filminstitut and Filmmuseum in Frankfurt, and Arsenal in Berlin. These are some of the projects that we will also address during the 7th International Conference, which will take place here at the end of May, and will also focus on the same theme, global audiovisual archiving. The conference has been organized in close collaboration with an advisory board that includes experts active in various countries in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa, including all the guest speakers who have been invited for the This Is Film series. The program, which will be both online and in person, includes more than 70 speakers from very diverse realities from within and outside formalized institutions worldwide. We hope that with this conference we'll be able to facilitate the creation of a network for the long-term exchange of knowledge and practice in our field. So now I would like to introduce Ahmed Abdul Magid, Emma Brand, Amy Keegan, and Emma van der Westen, who are the This Is Film students in charge of the session today. They will, Amy, on behalf of the group, will introduce our guest.
Hi. Aboubakar Sanogo is an associate professor in film studies at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. Some of his research interests include African cinema, Afro-diasporic cinema, transnational and world cinema, film archiving, film heritage, colonial cinema, and post-colonialism. His work is located inside and outside academia, seeking to intervene in both spaces in a mutually transformative manner. In practice, this spans research, teaching, film curation, policymaking, and institution building. In his role as the North American Regional Secretary for the Pan-African Federation of Filmmakers, Aboubakar initiated and oversees their archival project. And in 2017, he launched the African Film Heritage Project as a joint initiative between the Federation, UNESCO, Cineteca di Bologna, and Martin Scorsese's nonprofit Film Foundation. That year, the project set out to locate and preserve 50 classic African films representing the 5 traditional regions of the continent, so north, south, east, west, central, while also counting the diaspora as an additional 6th. The international exchange of knowledge and practice therefore plays an important role in Aboubakar's work with the African Film Heritage Project. Also in 2017, the project released the inaugural film of its restoration work. The 1970 film Soleo, directed by Mauritanian filmmaker Med Hondo, was restored based on its ranking as one of the most important films in African cinema. Depicting the journey of a young African immigrant seeking his fortune among his colonizers in Paris, the film was restored through the use of film materials deposited by Hondo at Cine Archives, the audiovisual archive of the French Communist Party in Paris. The restoration was screened at Cannes Classics in May 2017, before later reaching many more film festivals around the globe. And at Carleton, Aboubakar has curated a retrospective of Hondo's cinema entitled The Indocile Image, the Cinema of Med Hondo, which included the first ever symposium of his work. He is currently working on completing 2 manuscripts, The History of Documentary in Africa, as well as an edited collection on Hondo's work, including Soleo, which will be screened today.
Thank you very much for this fantastic introduction, if I also include Joanna's. It's a great pleasure for me to appear, of course, in this course today. I'd like to thank everybody who was involved in facilitating my appearance in this class. Eleni Chiali, Gordon Smith, I believe, and of course the students for the wonderful questions they sent. But of course, first and foremost, Professor Bosati, who in fact approached me, I think about a year ago, after she was editing a piece on, I think, a special issue on the moving image, and somehow I sent one of the articles to review, and then after that, she invited me to join this fantastic initiative in thinking through the question of the global film heritage or audiovisual heritage, for that matter. I'm really glad I did accept to join. And so I'd like to salute, therefore, her contribution in helping create a platform where these pressing and complex issues can be discussed, and potentially new initiatives could emerge in order to respond to these questions. So thank you. I was asked to present on the African Film Heritage Project and the restoration of Methondo's Soleil-O. I'll try to do this toward the end, but I really feel that I should give you the context of and the reason why one is involved in this in the first place, and some of the stakes, if you will. So before, I'll just give you something to look at while I speak, I suppose. So the question of the archive, to me, is one of the most significant topics on the agenda of African film study, practice, and transmission today. Indeed, while debates on the histories of African cinema, the aesthetic trends and tendencies, the celebration and the critique of auteur, the emergence and spread of a strong, ambitious, and contagious genre tradition, the political economy of African cinema, the status of film festivals, and others, have received a lot of attention in the field. The question of the archive has, until recently, not attained significant traction. Many elements of explanation come to mind, including in the field itself, the absence, I would argue, of a vocabulary through which one could account for the archive as a legitimate field of study. But of course, the archival turn in recent years across the globe, I would say, and the accompanying theorization around it have contributed to increasingly enshrine it in the field of film studies, at least. Now, this does not mean by any means that the question of the archive is new in the context of Africa. Indeed, as far back as the years leading up to the advent of independence, one may think of many of the debates that took place within the context of Présence Africaine, which had a cinema commission. The question of the archive was actually already centrally put as far as cinema is concerned. This movement was a publishing house, a movement, and a think tank. It was all kinds of things. A set of globally ambitious conferences, festivals, etc., may be seen in many ways to be an archive of the decolonial idea on the continent. Its entire project, one would argue, was to revisit the African archive, globally speaking, in order to deny the legitimacy of the colonial disorder of things and to affirm the radical contingency of the colonial idea, situation, context, process, and regime in order to imagine another archive of future for the African continent and her diaspora. In that regard, the monumental General History of Africa project, which was supported by UNESCO and initiated by some of Présence Africaine's related scholars and founders of renewed history of the geographies of the continent, is potentially one of the single most significant archival projects of the last century. Now, it so happens that many of the filmmakers who would end up at the vanguard of African cinema were fellow travelers of these people of the tenors, so to speak, of Présence Africaine, and who will go on to create or co-create the most important and enduring institutions in African cinema. I'm thinking here of the Journée Cinématographique de Carthage, or JCC, or the Carthage Film Festival in English, and of course the Pan-African Film Festival of Ouagadougou, FESPACO, and the Pan-African Federation of Filmmakers, FEPAS, which will sustain the aspiration of and the battling for the existence and the perennisation of a rich and dense African moving image tradition. So some of the filmmakers behind this, of course, you all know them. You may know them. If you know a bit of African cinema, you would have heard of Ousmane Sembène, Paulin Vieira, Timothée Bassori, Aboubakar Sanogo, and many others. And so even a retrospective look back, cursory look back at these debates, if you will demonstrate that these institutions, the three institutions that I just mentioned, were staging ground for some of the most significant debates regarding the nature, the object, the direction, and contradiction of African cinema. It seems to me that we are in a moment where a more systematic exploration should be undertaken in its multiple modalities, forms, and dimensions. This, at least, is one of the tasks that I have assigned myself in recent years. Through research, teaching, my participation in various initiatives, domestic, regional, continental, and indeed around the archive in order to contribute to the further institutionalization of what I refer to as the Cine archival idea. To me, the Cine archival refers to the moving image archive understood as an object of inquiry with certain uncertain boundaries, as embedded in a multiplicity of forms. It constitutes the coming together in the conjunction and perhaps even the superimposition of both the moving image and the archive as modalities of discursivity. Indeed, the Cine in Cine archival refers not only to images in motion, but also, of course, the various apparatuses deployed to conceive it, to produce it, to circulate it, to screen it, to receive it, and, for a lack of a better term, due to its having been co-opted by capitalism, that is, to consume it. It also includes the various formats under which it was captured, of course, so you all know this, from the standard 35, 70 millimeter, 16 millimeter, 8 millimeter formats, and of course the various video and digital formats, the knowledges and know-hows related to them. So part of it is also, of course, what I call the paratextual dimensions of it, of course, the scripts, the poster, the correspondence, the invoices, and so on and so forth, and the cultures it manages to produce. Now, the archival in the Cine archival, of course, to me, refers to theories, philosophies, practices, institutions, histories, technologies, knowledges, and know-how partaking in the production of our dynamic and multiple and contradictory relationships to the past. And indeed, to quote one of my colleagues here, Jamie Barron, its uses, reuses, misuses, and abuses in processing such relationship through various modalities of subjectivities, memories, and identities. So this radically interdisciplinary dimension of the archival, while also, of course, including the question of professionalization, reminds us that just as film is too important to be left to filmmakers alone, the history is too important to be left to historians alone, the archive is too important to be left to archivists alone. Although without archivists and their profession, there would never be, would be elsewhere, so we'll be having this conversation in the first place. So the project for me, therefore, to refract these intense and dense configurations of the Cine archive through the prism of Africa, which for me is in fact the ultimate continent archive, or the archive continent, depending on how you want to see it. I don't know how you want to see it. Yeah. Because of course, it is the continent that is in effect the archive of the world, the archive of the human, because it has in effect begotten the human. We all know that. Nurtured the human. We also know that. Welcomed the first existent steps of the human. We all know that. Having heard the first speeches of the human, and of course, indeed, having enabled the first creative endeavors, human. Yeah, and even more, having offered the context for the creation of the matrix, the grammar, the vocabulary upon which any and all human culture, thought, inventions, and innovations are based. Or to paraphrase certain French philosophers, having established the conditions or possibilities of the laws of the sayable, the doable, and the imaginable. Now, this continent, of course, is also, in our historical conjuncture, the youngest in the world. So it's both the oldest and the youngest at once, by virtue of its population, which is hungry to take its rightful place in the world, having experienced some of the most traumatic events over the past, 500 years, no less. So battered, the object of social experiments and experimentations of all kinds, but confidently looking into the future and seeing possibilities and increasingly prepared to face all adversities by any means necessary, is also one of the contemporary stakes, and as also one of the stakes, and makes it one of the stakeholders of the archive. And so part of the project, I would have to say, is therefore to reposition for me the Africa in the archive and the archive in Africa through the moving image. And this, of course, because you are university students, so it would, I guess, we have to look at some of the scholarly implications of this. Historiographically speaking, it seems to me that it contributes to making a better understanding of the history of African cinema, a deeper comprehension of national cinemas of the continent, their internal complexities, their relationship between each other, the relationship between different regional cinemas across the continent, the national, the regional cinema history beyond, of course, the auteurs, which could make it possible for other figures, other movements, other tenets, other experiments to emerge through the analysis of the various forms of films that, of course, we'll encounter in the process of documentaries, newsreel, amateur, etc., etc. To also help expand the cinematic objects of study and generate knowledge about periodization of African cinema, the place of African cinema in the world, including the possibility to better position Africa in various movements in moving image history, from the silent to the sound era, and etc., etc. I'm going to skip this as many more, but I'm going to skip a little bit here. Of course, for us in our study of African cinema, the project will also add the field of the archival to the debates. We tend to focus a lot on aesthetics, politics, political economy, history, etc. It very literally opens up a field in African film studies itself. Indeed, as we know, in film and media studies, archival studies more generally, unfortunately, and moving image archival studies more generally, the place of Africa is often seen as marginal, often absent-mindedly referred to without any serious engagement with the complexities on the continent, the innumerable theoretical, historical, technological contributions to the archival idea, indeed, even perhaps its very invention. So finally, of course, some of the stakes, of course, archival institutions, their practices and discourses are often, as we know, so well based on a Eurocentric episteme. So the question remains, how do we go about decolonizing the archive epistemologically, and how might Africa play a role in reimagining a decolonized archival discourse and practices? What might the thousands cultures, the multi-millennial history of the continent offer us in terms of reimagining this question and the renewal of the way in which we think about it? What might be its implication in practice at all level for the moving image, etc. These are some of the stakes. And so now I'm going to move to back to my PowerPoint to make a distinction in at least between what I call the Fatassia Archival Project and the African Film Heritage Project. So the African Film Heritage Project is, in my mind, a program of the Fatassia Archival Project. And so I'll tell you a little bit about Fatassia, which was created in 1917, of course, in Tunis during the Carthage Film Festival. There's a continental body which is in charge of defending and promoting the interests of African filmmakers and film professionals. It's a fantastic organization which is recognized by the African Union, the Arab League, the European Union, UNESCO. And it's worked toward creating, over the past, since the 1970s, indispensable infrastructure for the production, distribution, exhibition, and circulation of films on the African continent. In recent years, however, of course, it has decided to have effect what we call an archival turn, because, of course, it faces itself with really serious problems around the transmission of the heritage of African cinema to a new generation, and how that could help for the identity of course, this new cinema and this continent. It also, of course, partakes in its desire to establish a continuous history of African film practice in the beginning of cinema. So it has, for all these reasons, decided to make the preservation of cinematic heritage a high priority. This, of course, again, is not the first time. As I mentioned, since the 1950s, it was part of its interest. And of course, in the 80s and 90s, this interest increased and led to the creation of the Cinémathèque Africaine of Ouagadougou, which is still in existence in the courtyard of Fespaco, for those of you who know Ouagadougou a little bit. Now, this, let's say, this almost third phase of Fapassi's investment in the archive involves, again, enabling the creation and enforcement of film archival institutions across the continent, engaging and partaking in the restoration of the African film heritage in order to make it available and seen across the continent and the world, facilitating and promoting the promotion of discourse, production of discourse and practice on the archival question in Africa as well. So a number of initiatives, therefore, have been in the works. One of the things that we are working toward is organizing what we call the States General of Film Archiving in Africa, with archivists, historians, and academics and curators from across the continent. The second initiative, of course, is as a result of this to create what we call the Association of African Film Archives, to exchange ideas, lobby our governments and other sectors, to develop and implement common projects and programs, share knowledge, expertise, insight. The third, I suppose, which this event may be part of this, to engage the global archival community on multiple fronts, including partaking in film archival debates and projects, capacity building, sharing expertise, in particular various training programs, research and development, etc. And finally, the African Film Heritage Project, which is a fantastic initiative that we are involved in. Okay. So, very quickly. So our most high-profile initiative to date is the African Film Heritage Project. You can see the logo of some of the people involved in this, of course, the Pan-African Films, the Pan-African Federation of Filmmakers, in partnership with Martin Scorsese's The Film Foundation. And of course, its FIAF affiliate archive, the Cineteca di Bologna, and of course the United Nations organization in charge of the preservation of culture generally, and heritage at UNESCO. Okay, so it's a program whose project is really to preserve and restore 50 African films of historic, cultural, and artistic significance. I think the student earlier just gave you an idea of what are some of the criteria that we use to decide on these films, but I don't know if I should go to maybe very quickly. So the list of films is drafted by Fepassi according to our criteria, because Fepassi is we really emphasize the PA in Fepassi, which is the Pan-African. We are here to the long Pan-African tradition on the African continent and in the diaspora. And we try to work toward a further reinforcement of that, I would even say ideology, if one could call it so. And so in that context, we consider that for the 5 traditional regions of continental Africa, plus the diaspora, should be part and parcel of what we do. Now, for this project, we are looking at 50 films, and so it's a lot and it's not much at the same time. If you consider the thousands of potential films that could be restored. And so we decided to really bracket it out over 100 years, let's say, from some of the very first Edison experiments of the moving images in the 1880s to 1989, which of course, as you know, marks a fantastic, a major historical turn for the world itself. We try to also take into account films that are fragile and in need of of immediate attention. For this group of films, we have divided them into major categories. The first major films by pioneering filmmakers in order precisely to work toward this question of the continuity and longevity of African film practice. And the second is avowedly auteurist. It really looks at some of the major works by African auteurs, which, as you know, the auteurist tradition was for a very long time on our continent. At least you should take a broad look at it. Arguably, the default tradition in African filmmaking. And so the idea is to really foreground these films for multiple reasons, many of which was that they almost nailed most of them by virtue, again, of the infrastructural and structural limitations that we faced since the beginnings of African cinema may not have been seen broadly, either in their own countries or across the continent. And so many of the film, in fact, was born, as soon as they were born, they went into the archive by virtue of not circulating, if you will. So that's important to keep in mind. And many of these films, of course, have received recognition from our two most important film festivals on the continent, that is FESPACO and GCC. And of course, includes the range of film practices that I mentioned already. Now, very briefly now, how do we work? I guess I should have talked more about the launch and so on and so forth, so I could go back very quickly to, oops. Oh my God, okay. Sorry, I'll go back again because my computer is acting up here. Where are we? Did I turn it off? Okay. Thanks. There we go. It's back now. Okay, here you go. It's completely vanished from my screen. God. Anyway, I'll show it to you later. So how do we work? So typically we set up a yearly calendar on the film that we hopefully, if we manage to raise enough funds, we could work on restoring. So we have sort of set up a set of priorities, after which sort of research in the archives and labs is undertaken to find some of the elements of the films. Then obviously we work with the rights holder, the filmmakers, so we ask them whether they want to take part in this project at all. And so once they do, then they give authorization to to at least take their films out of the archives. And of course, the work begins. So because we work with the Cineteca di Bologna, which has a fantastic lab called L'Immagine Ritrovata and L'Image Retrouvée, I think it's called. So the technical work is done there. Then, of course, filmmakers or DPs or people associated with the film get involved at the color grading stage, of course. So they typically travel there. So Med Hondo, for example, refused to travel. Like that, I mean, I travel. Typically, I say travel. Others did not. Anyway, so once all this work is done, of course, the question, of course, is to make the film seen again. And that involves festival screenings. We typically try to have the films out in 3 festivals. So as a partnership, we have our own festival, so to speak. So FESPACO, obviously. Il Cinema di Trovato, obviously. But of course, the Cannes Film Festival as well. And so there you go. So each of these places is very important. I would argue that probably FESPACO and El Cinema de Trovato are more important than Cannes for the reissue of these films, in my opinion, because at Cannes they get lost into the overemphasis on presentness. And of course, as you know, Bologna is really the home of you know, they are the most important archival film festival. And so it's the meeting place of historians, academics, people who matter in film historiography, in film studies, etc. And it has obviously implications, lots of implications. Very quickly, at FESPACO as well, it is the return of these films to their home in many ways, at least one of the first points of entry, because FESPACO is not all of Africa, but it is a place where many people of the African film community congregate twice every 2 years. And so we have a unique opportunity to show these films again to the African public. And to do this, perform this work of transmission that I was referring to. Now I have to add one more thing. In the process of really screening these films over the years, we have, and I think it's really one of the greatest successes. I really have to say that I'm very proud of this. That FESPACO has created, as a result of the work that we've been doing, something called FESPACO Classics. In other words, a section specifically devoted to the archive within the film festival itself. So it's no longer simply a competition of contemporary fiction film, documentary films, etc., short films, etc. But there's also a section devoted to the archives. So home of the archive at FESPACO. This is absolutely fantastic. And so after this festival, of course, as you know, they travel around the world and so on, so the global circulation, of course, in the US, in Europe, the Americas, in Asia. And in Africa, we're really working on a clear response to the question of the circulation of Africa, because from an infrastructure, we are really tremendously challenged from an infrastructure standpoint in terms of circulation, both of new and archival films. An important dimension of it, of course, is also to make the films available commercially again, and that I will never insist enough. Many of these films, what you discover in the process of the restoration is really the horrible, horrible, horrible contracts that exist between African filmmakers and mostly the European producers. And this is just a horror story. They take the films, they never return whatever benefits or income they generate from circulating the films. They confiscate the film. I mean, there's all kinds of trials of tribulation that's really, you can see that in some way the destruction of African cinema is in Europe in many ways, in many ways. And so many of these filmmakers have never actually made major benefits from their films. And so part of the project of recirculating these films is also to give them the opportunity to, at least at this late stage, to perhaps have some income in the process. And that is really important. And so, so the films are often, circulated through the Criterion Collection or other entity, depending on where they are. So Blu-ray, DVD, streaming, etc. There's also, of course, the educational market and others. Now, with it, of course, comes the press presence, because we also have to promote it in order for people to become aware. It's not enough to do the technical work. One has to be aware of it, of the meaning of this film, the significance, etc. And so the press releases, interviews, essays and so on and so forth all partake in presenting the work that we do. Now, we still have, of course, a lot of challenges relating to the status of our post-restoration element, the question of the rights holder and circulation of films, the question of some of the papers of African cinema, the relationship with our former colonizers, which is never, never easy. I can tell you that right now. The question of the digital and the debates around repatriation, and of course, the question of creating our own film preservations, safeguarding and restoration apparatus on the continent, which is really our ultimate goal as well. Okay, so very quickly now, if I can tell you about the film that you saw. So for Soleil, of course, Soleil was part of that list of 50 films. Now the work around it began much, much further before even the existence of this partnership, etc., of the Archival Project. It was really my own work, my own decision to really devote some significant amount of energy and time to writing a book on Medhondo, which is also part of what I'm doing, in addition to the anthology that was mentioned in the introduction. And so I'd organized a number of events in my university itself at Carleton here in 2016. I think it was mentioned, a retrospective at the Toronto International Film Festival, which was sort of one of the largest first and largest retrospectives on the cinema of Medhondo. And of course, as part of that, I wanted to have also a retrospective on Medhondo at Il Cinema Ritrovato. And so, so it was both personal and, let's say, institutional, because it was part of the list. So we decided to push it as a prototype number 1 by virtue of its absolute significance in so many ways for African cinema. Now, it helped that it was it's relatively easily accessible, because Med owned the rights to his film, all his films, and he knew where his negatives were, and they were essentially at Eclair and El Tisse. And we had already begun some work in relation to the Irish Film Archive in terms of producing new prints of the film. For example, for the Toronto retrospective, at least one new print two new prints was struck. 135 for Soleil and one for Polisario. And so it was easier to access, so he gave permission. The film was restored, as I said, at Limata Retrovata. And as I said, he didn't want to go, so he sent his, for the occasion, he decided to remain, I think, penciled with his director of photography, Francois Catoni, was a fantastic gentleman, who went to supervise the calibrating process. And so the film happened to be ready in time for the 2017 Cannes Classics. So it was submitted and selected, but Med refused to go to Cannes again. And so we had a FEPASI delegation already at Cannes. So I wrote a text to introduce the film to the audience there, and which was read, and it was read by, I really want to pay homage to her, Ozan Silou, who was one of our fantastic colleagues from Guadeloupe, who unfortunately passed away from COVID-19 a couple of years ago. And of course, I would argue that the rebirth, quote unquote, of Med did not happen at Cannes, but it was really in Bologna that it happened, when we did that retrospective that I was mentioning. And so the screenings were packed. The masterclass was, as you know, a great lesson of humanity, if you had a chance to see it. And so, of course, in the process, all the processes that I recounted before happened for that very film. And so an essay was written also in the process for the Criterion restoration and release of the, not restoration, release of the film, which I found out in the process that in fact the Criterion releases are actually not simply releases, they are actually events in the cinema. And so people really study them very seriously, which I'm very pleased with. And I looked, I think I found that one day on YouTube, just finding out what's happening with Soleil, film, etc. That the Japanese cinephile who actually purchases every single copy of the Criterion collection, I think his name is Daisuke Bappu, is very interesting. Who, in fact, so when he purchases the film, he opens it, he watches the film, and reads all the essays and comments upon the essay. So I'm like, okay. And I saw one day that there was something on Soleil. I'm like, wow, how come and so on. So I looked at it and I was really absolutely charmed to see what the fantastic work he was doing and it's part of the popularization, obviously, of the work. And I think it's also important to also see how these things circulate globally, as we said, as part of our conversation. I don't know if I have a clip here to show you.
About Med Hondo and how he seems to be, in essence, inventing a whole new cinematic language. I think that's Martin Scorsese's great phrase. And about the focusing in on the African immigrant experience in Europe, and about it's also closely linked with class issues and the like. And so this is a really great place to start when trying to get into this film for the first time. So that's the introduction by Martin Scorsese, approximately 3 minutes. So it's quite short, quite brief, but still packed with a lot of great information going forward. And then we have a lovely, lovely one-on-one interview, which is in fact a collection of talks with one-on-one with Med Hondo, conducted by Francois Catonnet in 2000.
I can't find this. Sorry.
And this is approximately 3 minutes, as being something that is also trying to speak to as I say, his upbringing, and is his discussion of theater and his experiences in the.
Sorry,
if he wanted to create something.
I can't find the exact clip anymore, so
there is, I think,
I'll
also
leave it there.
inherent
Just to let you know that the popularization, of course, and the just devoted and dedicated commentary on what they call the supplemental material of the film. Okay, and so after, of course, this, a number of things happened. There was, of course, as I said, FESPACO as well, and I think I'll end there. So they all ended up traveling across the world, in North America, etc., in Europe, in Africa. And of course, we showed it at FESPACO in 2019 in a 1200 theater on the opening night of the festival. Now, by that time, Med Hondo was already too sick to come to FESPACO. And so we showed it on the opening day of the festival. And of course, unfortunately, on the last day of the festival, on March 2, 2019, we received a call when we were preparing to go to the closing ceremony that Med Hondo had passed away. So it was obviously a very sad and traumatic event for us. We miss him tremendously and dearly here. He was a fantastic fellow traveler, somebody in whose presence you felt that Africa can achieve every single thing on this face of this earth. It was a really, really, really inspirational figure, and I'm glad to have been able to spend maybe roughly around 12 to 13 years on his side. I think I'll stop here. We can talk about other things, but I think I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Aboubakar. Thank you very much for this complete background to the African Film Heritage Project, how it came about, and zooming in on the criteria for choosing the films, and of course the work on the Med Hondo oeuvre and Soleil Haut. One thing I would like to ask you, and that's something that it's keep coming back since I've been reading about this fantastic project, is the I don't want to sound provocative with this, but of course you are also discussing how complex a project like this is in terms of relationship and also the horrible circumstances some of these films have been produced in, and the material that is in most cases to be found, if it is to be found in Europe. What I'd like to ask you is the choice of restoring these films in Europe. Because, of course, one could decide to find a way to restore the films where they were made, and with that promote a restoration practice in African countries. I was wondering if you've been thinking about this, and what are your thoughts?
Yes, of course, it's in the very beginning, in fact. The question of the archive is inseparable from, if you will, sort of the broader question of the relation between Africa and the rest of the world. Surely you're aware that, and this is one of the questions of sort of our colonial heritage, so to speak, that when Europe came to Africa, it was not interested in developing infrastructure in Africa. It created what we call the division of labor, the international division of labor, whereby the raw material would be, in fact, exported from Africa to Europe to be processed. Now, and so it was up to us in Africa to set up that infrastructure. And I mentioned that Fatassia has been, in fact, since 1970, invested in that. So we are still interested in that, but we cannot wait for all the infrastructure to be in Africa before we begin the restoration process. Just like we cannot begin to talk about the archive until we have solved all of our archival problems. We cannot begin to make films until you see what I mean. We cannot put the condition of having everything at home before starting to get involved in a process. It's absolutely counterintuitive, counterproductive, etc. And so one starts where one is in some ways. We are very pleased with at least with the work that we are doing, because in this European archive, our films are treated extremely well. And that was not always the case. If you know the way in which Med Hondo, for example, he edited the film that you saw, Soleil O. Soleil O was edited in sometime between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. in the lab of the big French companies, where, of course, the commercial films and the Godards and others had to be processed before. You see? Those were the conditions. And so these are not the conditions that we encounter, for example. Right? We are very proud that our films are, you see our films, you see Rossellini's film, you see, I don't know, Satellite's film, you see Bergman's film, I don't know, etc. Everything that's out there. And so that alone is important. Second, the partnership was precisely to really help alleviate some of the difficult infrastructural difficulties that we have. We still have the same infrastructural difficulties that we had at the beginning of our filmmaking process. So certainly since the times of independence, because in the process of trying to set up our own infrastructure, we face also opposition from the same colonial masters or former colonial masters who boycott the initiative, try to sabotage it, etc., infiltrate, corrupt, our colleagues, our governments, there's all kinds of things that makes it so that, the question of infrastructure remains a key question. Now, you have to also keep in mind, and that's a part of the coloniality of the archive, that when the technologies around film preservation and reservation were designed, they were not designed with Africa in mind. They were designed really with Europe and North America in mind, essentially. You see? And so our conditions of heat, of et cetera, of dust, et cetera, of construction, et cetera, are really unique and call for unique responses. And this is why I feel that we are really at this particular moment at the stage where the question of decolonizing the archive is also to decolonize the thinking that on which both the practice of the archive, the technologies of the archive, the political economy of the archive. In fact, that's really the key word here, is geared toward places like us, like Africa. You see? If you see the problem that we see today, in fact, and it's not in Africa, and Latin America, largely many of the same issues we encounter in some Asian countries, etc. It shows us, in fact, very simply, that we were not, let's say the rest of the world was never the priority of those who were thinking about the art. It's very, very, very upset. If they were interested, we would have solutions to this infrastructure problem overnight. We saw just 2 years ago that something that could come out of nowhere, for example, called COVID-19, in situations where we're always told that there's no funding for anything, it's a budget cuts, and all of a sudden, thousands of billions of dollars disappear out of nowhere to solve the problem of COVID-19, because of course it mattered for the survival of Europe, as you know, and the global north, as you call it. So that much money could have solved our infrastructure very quickly in 5 minutes, as you know so well. So that's where I think that's where the question should be asked in a way, because in some ways, structurally speaking, there's almost something written into making these difficulties be what they are and not easy to transcend. That to me is really the more important question, it seems to me.
Thank you. Now I know Ahmed has a question.
Hello. Thank you, Aboubakar, for the great insight that you've just brought to us. And I guess following up on Joanna's point, there's this skewed notion of like cultural heritage originating, in the global north, or that it's like this is where it's supposed to be, this is where all it's at. I was wondering if you could tell us more about how you see the work of the African Film Heritage Project sort of challenging or subverting that notion.
I guess the answer to your question is the answer that I gave in some ways, right? In other words, it's not only the technological dimension of the archive that is Eurocentricized, it's also even the very thinking about the archive or the heritage in this particular case that is Eurocentricized. I mean, how can we say in 2022 or whenever that those ideas were put forward, that the notion of heritage, cultural heritage, is a European or Western invention, so to speak? If you think of my introduction, where I mentioned that Africa is the archive of the world, it's obvious. If people know a minimal amount of history, they would know that, of course, for Europe to exist, it took the human beings who were born in Africa to actually cross the Gibraltar Strait up to this side, be transformed into what we call the Europeans today, and therefore bring with them some of the whatever cultural heritage that are already been produced in the first place. And there's also, as I said, the question of the creation of the very infrastructure of the production of culture itself. You know very well, of course, that the way in which Europe has constructed itself over, in fact, since the days of, let's say, the colonies, so to speak, the 19th century, it was, of course, around the idea of the centrality of the Greco-Roman paradigm as the cultural heritage that brought about the Renaissance of Europe, and therefore give us the modernity in which, and the capitalist modernity in which we are living today. But, even European historians know very well that before there was Greece, before there was Rome, there was Africa, there was Asia as well, we should say. But there was definitely first Africa. There were cultures, for example, closer to them on the Mediterranean or down all the way down to Sudan and other places, where the vocabulary, where the students from Europe who became our great philosopher that we quote at length, our great mathematician, our great physicists and others, came to Africa, came to ancient Egypt, came to Africa to learn, simply. To learn, and then go and transform it, of course, with their own context, etc., and give us what we have. So any knowledge of history cannot even take this idea very seriously, as far as I'm concerned. Now, our Archival Project is also a part of the reverse. The idea is to reverse this idea in the first place, because of course the version of history that I gave to you is not one that is transmitted to European children or students in the case of those who are in front of me here. It is not. It is one that centers Europe as the beginning of history, as the actor of history, etc., which it definitely is a major actor of history, but it's not the beginning and nor the only or sole actor. And so part of the project is also to intervene at the level of even the writing of history itself. And many of the people that are filmmakers frequented, in particular in the 1950s and 1960s, were part of that generation of Africans who were trying to rewrite that history. Right, so I think of Cheikh Anta Diop, Frantz Fanon, Césaire, all these people. Well, they believe in these things, but the question has always been the transmission. In other words, is there any interest in what would it mean for the world to know today, for example, for all of European children to be taught every single morning, or Western children to be taught every single morning that really the element for the genesis of the culture is not really in Western Europe, but in Africa. I don't know if you can imagine the radical transformation that this implies in terms of even just self-positioning in relation to the rest of the world, and therefore some of the implications that could be in terms of knowledge production, technological production, military production, economic production, the whole thing. So that's one of the ways in which, so our very existence in some way of the African film heritage, for let's say a global Archival Project, the African Film Heritage Project, participate in that. You remember in Medhon, I don't want to discuss the film already because it's for tomorrow. You remember in the film, after the sort of animation section, you have this direct address scene with these Africans who are looking straight at the camera. And say exactly what I was saying. So we had our own civilization, we had our own culture, we were able to do this or that, and this and that, etc., etc. These are, if you will, cinematic renderings of the historiography of people like Cheikh Anta Diop, Joseph Kizerbo, and so on and so forth. So he just starts there, right? By sort of revising the dominant and hegemonic history that are being taught to us. And so, by its very existence, I would argue that our Archival Project partakes in that. It partakes in pluralizing approaches, therefore, to heritage and culture, to obviously democratizing them so that other, so-called marginalized, but really central, if you look at it from a historic standpoint, could also contribute to the conversation and shape the conversation, more importantly, shape the agenda for research, for teaching, for discourse production, for technological invention, etc., etc. Yeah, anyhow.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
And we have a follow-up question from Emma.
Hi, Aboubakar. Thank you very much for
Yes.
your presentation. I think you've answered this mostly, but maybe you want to say some more. In what ways does the African Film Heritage Project offer the opportunity to upturn the most limiting or short-sighted practices of film preservation that have been established in the global north?
I may have already answered aspects of this in some way, but one of the ways to think about it, again, is in simply being in the room and contributing to this conversation. Obviously, I think we partake in that, but part of it is really to see, okay, at the end of the day, what does it mean to look, and if we could put because in some way we can say we have a Eurocentric heritage of the archive, of film preservation, etc., etc. And then we're gonna ask the question, what would it mean to think, re-put all these problems, if you were to just take, let's say, Africa as a point of departure? What would you see? What would you do, etc.? Right? If you study, for example, and I'm no specialist, I don't really know much of it by beyond what I've read very cursively, etc., etc. But if you really look, for example, of the way in which the archival idea was embedded, for example, in sort of, you can say, ancient Africa, for example. You can say, for example, that there was never, ever a separation between, let's say, the scientific dimension of the archive, the historical dimension of the archive, etc. They were all, in other words, the archive was always already radically interdisciplinary in many, many, many ways, right? And the way in which the preservation practice is there seems to be a silo between different fields. Let's say the archivists do their thing, the academics do their thing, the historians do their thing. Obviously they interact, but there's not a feeling that there's an inextricable, fluid and indispensable relationship between one another. But in those cultures, in which you can argue that the archival idea was theomorphized, if you will, take the forms of God, so to speak. You would see that the God of the archive, or the God of time, of the sciences. It's a sort of mix of all these, and I feel that this could also help us rethink this question in terms of its interdisciplinarity. In terms of research and development, as I said, again, if we were to imagine a new moment of the archival movement, the global archival movement, let's say, as trying to find solutions precisely to the specific problems that we have, let's say, in Africa, let's say. It's a way you have the weather is not always clement to the films. We don't have air condition, so energy is not really where it should be, etc., etc. Yet, of course, we have fantastic source of energy. The most important source of energy that nature ever gave us was the sun, right? But there's sort of the idea of really making it a high-tech, supersonic invention that would, be conserved and generate energy for the entire planet. For me, for example, is a research and development question for issues of preservation, for example. The idea, of course, that if you think of the way in which, for example, the technology of cinema has evolved, it has always evolved, it's often, I would say, evolved in relation to, let's say, finding, if you will, more affordable ways of making films, right? So you have 35, at some point 16 got involved. That allowed the avant-garde to be involved, the documentary filmmaker to be more involved in the process, et cetera, because it's extremely expensive. And then you can move forward, with video again, more people get involved, et cetera, and think about if we were still in the age of celluloid, for example, the world would never have seen the emergence of something like Nollywood, for example, right? So, but instead of Nollywood being a sort of after effect of the technological development, what if we put that premise as the point of departure for thinking about other ways of imagining film technology, film preservation, et cetera, et cetera? That to me is an interesting question issue. Yeah, issues of scarcity. I mean, when you go sometimes to, I shouldn't say this out loud, but I have to be honest that in going to some of the PF congresses, when you sit down, every couple of years they decide, okay, when is the next congress going to take place? So every country has to come and present the case for why you should go to Switzerland, to Hungary, etc., to Bangladesh, etc. And when you look at the unbelievable amount of wealth that's put into the infrastructure of the archive, I have to say I had a sort of almost a fantasy that if I were to go to the Switzerland one, I was going to say, well, listen, I love the infrastructure, it's fantastic and all, but, actually we have a lot of, Switzerland has really welcomed a lot of African public money in its banks, as you know so well, through our dictators, our Mobutus and others, etc., etc. So would it be possible to have some of this and put it into our little infrastructure problems in Africa, maybe? that could help us solve our problem, because, again, the problem in Africa, as you know, is not that it is poor, it is that it is impoverished very systemically and systematically, as you know so well. If the terms of trade were fair to Africans, if the terms of exchange were fair to Africans, African country would be actually pretty rich and could spend, in fact, money on our infrastructure, on doing our own restorations at home, and so forth. So the problem, our problems are linked, you see. The wealth of the one is the poverty of the other, as you see so well. So that's also one of the ways one has to think about this and think about the choices that are left, in fact, that are made available, etc., etc.
Thank you very much. This was very inspiring. I see that we need to move on to the screening now. So I'd like to thank you again for being with us today. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you to Emma and Ahmed and Amy for your introduction and questions. Well, as you know, the students will have more time to discuss further these issues with you tomorrow. For the audience, we'll post this session online in a couple of weeks if you want to review some of the passages. And I hope to see you all back for the final session of This Is Film on May 18. We will talk about the rediscovery of Indonesian filmmaker Ratna Asmara with film archivist Lisa Bonaraman and film critic Umi Lestari. Before we move to the screening, just bear with me while I mention to you a special screening planned here on May 23 that might be of interest to you. In the framework of the series Restored and Unseen, we will show the recent 4K restoration of the Mandabi, the Senegalese classic made in 1968 by Ousmane Sambène. And now, thank you again, Aboubakar, and everybody. Enjoy the screening of Medhondo's Soleil Haut.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to be with you. And now I want to make sure that it doesn't mean that we don't believe in collaboration and all of this stuff. But if you want to just say that structural issues have to go also take into account. There you go. Thank you very much.
Thank you.